Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Melanie Ross and I will be your presenter today for our complimentary webinar, Method Witnessing for Internal Audits. Please note that we are recording this webinar, so it will be available on our website for future viewing. Just some logistics before we get started. Due to the high attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter any questions you may have into the Q&A box. I've planned time at the end of the webinar to answer questions that are asked. Also, before we get started, I just want to give this disclaimer here. Our webinar is for informational purposes only. The information that's provided today is not intended to direct your organization to specific requirements. We always say to consult with your accreditation body or your certification body for requirements for internal audits beyond the standard requirements. What we're going over today for method witnessing for internal audits is if you choose to include method witnessing in your internal audit program or process, these are some tips, tricks, and techniques that you could use as part of that method witnessing. Our key takeaways today is to learn what is method witnessing and how is it different from just observations made during an internal audit. We'll explain why method witnessing can be a valuable tool for internal audits, for laboratories, as well as for other types of organizations. And we're also going to review mechanisms for recording objective evidence during that method witnessing process. I'll begin with defining what is an audit. The definition for audit comes from ISO 9000-2015, 3.13.1, with some slight modifications for our context. An audit is a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining objective evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria are fulfilled. There are some key terms to look at within the term for audit, and that is systematic. That's the first term we want to look at. Our audits need to have structure around them. We want to make sure that we are consistently performing our internal audits using an internal audit method, process, or procedure that makes it systematic. The next word is independent. We want to make sure that our internal audits or our internal auditors are independent of the area being audited. There's many different reasons for this, and some ISO standards require that independence, but really it provides impartiality of the auditors, but it also allows for the auditors to look at the processes in a different way than the individuals that are performing the processes being audited. We have documented. Those of us in the ISO world know if we didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So our internal audits are summarized in some manner, such as an internal audit report, for example. The next term is objective evidence. Our audits are objective. We have requirements that we are auditing to, and we look at evidence to determine if those requirements are met or not. And method witnessing or observation is one way to obtain that objective evidence. Then we look at the extent to which the audit criteria are fulfilled. Within that, one word is audit criteria. Those are our requirements. When we're looking at the extent to which those requirements are fulfilled, that's where we're looking at our objective evidence. And in our presentation today, we're focusing on objective evidence that we gather through our eyes and our ears during our internal audits. Most audits use a process approach. That's where we audit our organization's processes and their interactions in relation to one or more management system standards. So we're looking at process by process, but we also want to look at the interactions of those processes. So example, purchasing into raw material receipt into the laboratory using those materials. So there are interactions between processes that are also important for us to audit. And method witnessing is one of the ways to do that. When we use a process approach to auditing, we achieve consistent and predictable results when activities are understood and managed in an interrelated process that functions as a coherent system. So we look at those interactions, the interrelations of those processes as we do our method witnessing, and that gives us a more robust internal audit process as well. One other thing I wanted to cover about different types of audits is the concept of horizontal versus vertical audits. A horizontal audit is going across many departments or functions. We're looking at one process, but we're going from start to finish. So in my purchasing example, it could be receipt of materials through to reporting results. We're looking at one across the organization, start to finish. So it's that raw material going from being received through use in the laboratory. When we look at a vertical audit, then we are looking at all processes and activities within one department or function. We're looking up and down within that department or function. Both horizontal and vertical audits have different purposes in our internal audit program, and it's up to the organization to determine which type of audits work best for each audit or for the organization as a whole. And my guess is that your internal audit programs would be a mix of horizontal and vertical audits, even if you don't call them that by name. There are many different methods that we can use during our audits, and some of those methods are listed here. We can conduct interviews. We can complete those checklists of standard requirements and conduct our document review. Document review can be conducted before the audit begins, or it could be done during the audit, or a combination of both. We use sampling because we know we can't look at everything during the audit. We can't look at every record, every process, every time the process is performed. We gather samples as part of our audit process. We observe the work being performed, and we analyze data gathered during the internal audit. All of these methods can be used in method witnessing in some manner. When we look at gathering objective evidence effectively, we combine the methods listed here. We look at those document reviews. We have to listen effectively. We interview the individuals, we make observations as internal auditors, and then we look at that method witnessing. And I'd like to look at the difference between observation and method witnessing, since we're going to focus on method witnessing for the rest of the presentation. When we look at simple definitions of observation versus witnessing, an observation is general attention to or watching of surroundings and activities. That can be a walkthrough of the area where work is performed. Maybe it's a facility tour or a tour of the department or laboratory where you are performing the audit. You're just observing your surroundings, making visual notation of things that are around in the area that's being audited. Observation is the act or process of generally reviewing something or versus watching someone carefully to gain information. So when we look at witnessing, that's where we have direct observation or the intentional act of watching personnel perform tests or measurements. So we watch the personnel perform that task or that activity or that process. And I intentionally left out the word authorized when I read the definition of witnessing, because authorization is an important part of internal audits to confirm that the personnel that you're witnessing are authorized to perform that task. But that may not be the intent of your internal audit. Your internal audit is looking at the personnel performing the tasks, the activities, and the processes. That authorization verification may come somewhere else. So I just wanted to make note of that. So when we do observations, we're looking at those facilities and environmental conditions. So you're looking at is the temperature correct? So that observation is more of a feel observation. Is it too cold or too hot? Is there a draft over balances? Things like that. And the facilities, are they controlled in the manner that need to be controlled? Are the individuals in the area supposed to be there doing the work in that area? We're observing storage conditions. We're looking at equipment, maybe not in great detail, but looking at, is there any equipment that has been taken out of service? Is it marked as such? These are things we can see as we walk through an area as we're doing our observations. We're also looking at some of those more non-technical processes as well. When we look at method witnessing, it can be essential to determining technical competence. So if you are accredited or seeking accreditation, your assessors come in to evaluate technical competence of the laboratory. When using method witnessing in your internal audits, that technical competence piece may or may not be a part of your internal audit. It really depends on who the auditors are. Oftentimes, our internal auditors are trained as internal auditors, but are not necessarily trained on the processes that they are auditing. And that's the difference between the term audit and assessment. Our internal auditors are not necessarily determining technical competence. They are looking at a procedure, a work instruction, and saying, are they performing the work according to that work instruction or procedure? So I just want to point that out because it may not be used to determine technical competence. It may be used as a form of determining conformance or nonconformance to requirements in a standard or your procedure. We can perform method witnessing on site or remotely. There are some challenges if we are performing method witnessing remotely. Obviously, our observations during method witnessing are limited because we can only see where the camera is pointing. So we need to keep that in mind as a risk to our audits when we are determining if we are going to perform that method witnessing on site or remotely. You do want to identify your key considerations if you are going to use method witnessing as part of your internal audits, or key risk considerations, I should say. You want to look at, are you determining or evaluating technical competence? What is the intent of your method witnessing? Do you want to see that individuals are performing the methods correctly or to the procedure? Are you evaluating a new procedure to see if training was adequate? What is the method witnessing's purpose? And what is the risk involved in that? So one risk back to that technical competence is to document whether that is a part of your internal audit or not. If you say that technical competence evaluation is not a part of your method witnessing, then that would be something to document as your consideration for that method witnessing, just to understand what is the intent, how will that method witnessing serve you during your internal audits in gathering objective evidence. So method witnessing in internal audits can provide internal auditors objective evidence of conformance with methods to specified requirements. And I want to go to the next slide to kind of explain what I mean with that. So again, your internal auditors may not possess the technical expertise of the method they're witnessing. They're trained as auditors to look at a process, to look at the documentation related to that process, and determine if requirements have been met or not. So you want to define the purpose of your method witnessing if it is going to be a part of your internal audits. So basically, our internal auditors compare the contents of procedures with standard methods or the source of that procedure where applicable, if a standard method was not used. Then they confirm performance of the method based on the written procedures, the work instructions, etc. So our auditors are looking at specified requirements or our audit criteria, They're looking at the documentation within your organization, and they're saying in that interaction, do those two match? Does the documentation explain how to meet the requirements? And then that method witnessing is where they're actually watching the method being performed, the activities related to the method, in order to say, is the performance meeting the procedure? So sometimes in our internal audits, we do that middle section of this slide where we compare the contents of our procedures to the requirements. And we say those match. And then we write an audit report and we say our system is effectively implemented. Where method witnessing can up the game on your internal audit, so to speak, is then to get that second piece to say, are the people performing those methods based on the procedures? It's a good way to evaluate different aspects of your operations, and one of those is training. So if you watch two different people perform the same method and they do it differently, that may point to an issue with training, where they were trained differently or by different trainers. There's a lot of other things that method witnessing can bring out as well, such as types of reagents that are being used. Are they correct? The skills and abilities of the personnel performing maybe sampling or sample prep, using those balances, scales, pipettes, things like that. So there's just a lot of aspects of actually watching the people do the work that can come into your internal audits. Now, it is up to the organization to determine, is that, I don't want to say important, is that crucial for our internal audits? Is it applicable to our internal audits? And it may not be applicable for every process or every audit that you're performing. Maybe it's sprinkled into some of the audits that are more technical or more activity-based that are generating results in the laboratory or producing products in a manufacturing environment, for example. When we do method witnessing activities, we observe the process being performed. That's the biggest part of the method witnessing. However, we have to prepare ahead of time. So that's where document review comes in with reviewing the procedure. Also, a part of method witnessing is interviewing personnel. So asking the people doing the work the questions of, how were you trained? What retraining do you get? What reagent do you use? Or most recently on an assessment, I saw someone doing something that I had never seen before. And I said, why are you holding it that way? Right? So it's asking questions to gather more objective evidence related to your audit criteria. And then the last piece, it says inspect equipment, but I want to explain that word inspect. We're not inspectors as internal auditors, so we're not looking at equipment for proper functioning and things like that. We're looking at the equipment to determine, is it calibrated if it needs to be? Are maintenance plans in place if that's applicable? Are there calibration stickers on the equipment? Is the equipment that's defined in the procedure actually the equipment that's being used? So keep that in mind when you think inspect equipment. You're not looking at that equipment to make sure it's functioning correctly. You're just comparing the equipment being used and the traceability and the quality of that equipment based on the procedures and the information you gather as part of your internal audit. When we talk about reviewing the procedure, we obviously want to read the procedure or the work instruction that's going to be a part of that method witnessing in the internal audit. Again, we compare that back to the source of that method, whether that's a standard method or a customer requirement or an industry method. And then we can verify key points, such as environmental conditions, times, if there's retention times or incubation times or settling times, things like that. You can look at the reagents that are listed in the method and determine or evaluate during your audit, are they using those reagents in the amounts specified? And sometimes our procedures or our work instructions will have some qualifications or authorizations that individuals need to possess in order to perform that procedure or do that work instruction. And in those cases, our internal auditors could verify through training records or through authorization matrices or whatever else is in place if that individual has those qualifications or authorizations. That can also be done through interview, but we want to verify with records that the organization has and not just rely on word of mouth. Observing the process is where the bulk of the method witnessing comes. We actually watch the people doing the work. We can watch sample preparation and handling if that's a part of the work that's being performed. We look at those environmental conditions that are defined in the procedure. Now, again, our internal auditors are looking at the procedure and saying, is the procedure being followed? They may not have the technical competence to say this environmental condition is incorrect in the procedure. They're verifying that the procedure as written is being performed and that the environmental conditions are correct as applicable. If it's a part of the process and your internal audit criteria, you could review measurement traceability. This helps with that traceability chain if you are accredited in order to prepare for your external assessments. And then you can review activities that are related to the validity of results, such as quality control, materials being tested, or if the laboratory participates in proficiency testing. Again, it just depends on what is the intent of your internal audits, what is the audit criteria for that audit, and does it make sense for you to add that into your audit program? And then lastly, we would look at reports and statements of compliance. That's where the data is being generated or being reported out to the customer, whether internal or external. So that could be a part of that horizontal audit or the vertical audit, depending on the process that you are auditing. We interview the personnel by asking questions about the process. Asking questions of personnel about the process is one way, again, to determine how trained they were. Do they understand the steps of the process and how to perform the process? An interview of personnel may depend on how long they've been performing the process. If they're relatively new, you may not be asking about method validation or method verification, but rather what steps of the process are they performing for you and how do they understand how those steps go together. Interviews also allow us a time to seek clarification. We read the procedure, we watch them perform the process, then we can ask, like in my example, why did you do it that way? And not in a negative way, but to ask, what is the reasoning behind the way that you're performing the process? For my case as an assessor, when I have that hat on, I like to wait to ask questions until they're done so that I'm not interrupting them as they're doing the work. But it just depends on the process, the individuals and the auditors that are doing the method witnessing on when is that interview going to take place. And again, the interview can verify if personnel understand the process that they're performing or the piece of the process that they're performing. So I went into this a little bit to begin with because I wanted to say something about that inspect equipment, but these are some of the activities that you can do with relation to equipment as part of method witnessing. You can verify those calibration labels in the area where the work is being performed. And then one step further is looking at the calibration certificates to ensure that the labels match the certificate. Method witnessing for equipment in internal audits is a really good way for laboratories specifically to ensure that equipment is within its calibration cycle. So in the laboratory, individuals are using the equipment, and are they confirming that that equipment is within its calibration cycle and not past due? So it's just another piece of information to feed back into your management system about how the calibration program is working. So we're gathering information away from the laboratory or from where the work is being performed into a different area for that interrelated activity of calibration with laboratory activities. The other thing that we can do is verify if there are intermediate checks that need to be performed, such as daily balance checks or maybe even continuing quality controls. So that box can mean a lot of different things. And then if it's important to your internal audit and to the audit criteria, you could look at those equipment maintenance logs as well. Method witnessing can be a valuable tool, and it doesn't have to be implemented all or nothing. So you can determine how much of this method witnessing you want to incorporate into your internal audits to gather information and objective evidence to further improve your management system and technical operations. So we can verify that the laboratory procedures or organizational procedures match standard methods or industry methods or the source of that procedure. Then we can verify that laboratory performance matches the procedure. Then we look at those records that come out of that process and say, do the records contain the results of the activity being performed and sufficient information based on what is required by the procedure? So you can see we can gather quite a bit of information just by using our eyes and ears in the area where the work is being performed. Also, another way that method witnessing is a valuable tool for organizations is think about personnel in your organization when you have an external assessment or external audit. They're probably nervous. So if you are incorporating method witnessing into your internal audit program, it can prepare personnel for those external audits or assessments because they're used to having someone watch them do their work from an internal audit perspective. So it's just another way to prepare them by showing them kind of what it'll look like. Of course, it'll be a little different. It's an internal person. You're not verifying technical competence, so to speak. So it can look and feel a little different, but it gives them a flavor of what it would be like to participate when that external person is in, walking through your areas, watching people do the work. Again, it provides that practice of performing processes for your external assessments. When we're recording objective evidence through method witnessing or just observation in general, we need to listen to what is said. We also need to understand what we hear, and we take notes. Taking notes while doing method witnessing or observation may be one of the harder ways to take notes because you're taking notes as someone is talking or as you are talking, and taking notes as someone is performing a process. That's why preparation is key in reviewing the procedures and work instructions and understanding those key points that you need to verify during that method witnessing. So why do we take notes? Taking notes is documentation of proof for objective evidence. They support findings and provide evidence for nonconformities or for conformities as well, conforming to requirements. They can also identify side issues that may require follow-up during the audit process. For example, you're performing method witnessing and you see a calibration sticker that is past due. You may want to go outside of the laboratory area or the area where the work is being performed and check the calibration records to determine, is the equipment past due or is maybe the sticker not up to date? So you could circle that in your notes and say, I'll go back to this later. And that's a way to use your notes to evaluate that side issue if it's a part of your audit criteria. And then lastly, during the audit, our notes guide us to audit trails to ensure that the audit activities meet the audit objectives. So side issues are directly related. So that calibration certificate was directly related to the equipment. Audit trails may lead us to a completely different area that was not a part of our initial audit criteria or audit objective. These are just a few note-taking best practices, certainly not an all-inclusive list, and it's from experience of our assessors and tips and tricks that they have provided for new assessors coming on board. So you can call out follow-up items and audit trails using a little box or a circle, and then cross that box or circle off if you've followed up on that item. So example, you need a record while you're in the area where the work is being performed and the record is somewhere else. To not interrupt the flow of the audit, you just make a circle or a square, and then when you're finished with that area, you go out and find that record. You can also highlight potential issues if that's allowed in your document entries to highlight instead of making those boxes or squares. You record the details on the objective evidence. So the procedure says, do this for 20 minutes at 16 degrees. So you have that in your notes and you verify, did they do that for 20 minutes at 16 degrees? Those are the details that we record in our notes as objective evidence. And then it says avoid opinions and unsubstantiated conjecture. This comes from the guidance document for internal audits. Sometimes, or audits in general, sometimes in internal audits, this could be a valuable tool. If someone says, I think we do it that way, but I'm not really sure, or I think this department is doing XYZ, it could lead to some valuable information for your management system for continual improvement. So you want to use that cautiously. You want to capture the notes that support the audit process and your audit objectives. Typically, those opinions and unsubstantiated conjecture don't support our audit conclusions, but it could be good somewhat good information to gather as well. Then you have to look at how detailed should my notes be. We want to be able to recreate our observations from our notes and have that evidence of conformance or nonconformance, if that's the case, 1 day, 1 month, 1 year later. Taking notes is an art form that you develop the more audits you perform. So early on in auditing, your notes may be more simplistic and less detailed than they are as you gather more experience. We also want to consider having a standard format for our notes. This is not a requirement, it's just a consideration where you have, you're auditing a process that will have a time, a temperature, and a lot numbers and things like that. So you have a form that has those blanks in order to fill them out. That's pretty detailed and probably not possible for all internal audits. But if you can come up with a simplified, standardized format for notes, it helps to remind and reinforce your auditors on what it is that they are auditing. Again, not a requirement, just a tip and trick about internal auditing notes. Oftentimes our notes are just a notepad that we're writing down on, and that's perfectly fine as well. So if we can't recreate our observations in the future, then we're not taking down enough detail. So we want to think about continual improvement as us as internal auditors, that the next time we do an internal audit, we write down or take notes in more detail. This is an example. It's just an example sample from ANAB's technical competence evaluation form, or our method witnessing form. Across the top, we're writing what we're looking at and who we're observing. And then down the left-hand side, we're looking at different aspects of method witnessing from an assessment perspective of what we need to look at. So when we're doing method witnessing, whether it's for an internal audit or for an external assessment, you could look at those facilities and environmental conditions. We already talked about looking at equipment and the procedure itself and those records. So it just provides a reminder to the assessor or the auditor for an internal audit of what it is they should be looking at, and kind of shows them where they should be asking questions when they're interviewing personnel or when they're looking at the procedure and the process being performed. So again, this is just an example. It depends on what process you're auditing and what information you need to gather to ensure that your audit criteria or those requirements are being met. So in conclusion, Our method witnessing is one way to generate objective evidence during internal audits. We use method witnessing, or can use method witnessing, along with all of our other audit methods to ensure that conformity to requirements is documented. So we combine that method witnessing with all of the other audit activities to provide insight into our methods and how those methods are being performed in the laboratory. It adds that next step in the process from going from method meets requirements to performance meets methods. And then that gives us that extra information of saying performance meets requirements. Just goes that one step further in our internal audit process. We've had a few questions come in so far, but I want to give you some time to enter your questions if you have any. So I'm going to just go over some additional resources that are available to organizations that are seeking accreditation or that are already accredited, and some resources that are good whether you're accredited or not. We have many different media to further your understanding of standards, accreditation, management systems in general, and assessment processes. On our ANAB website, we have a few free webcasts on a variety of topics. They're about 5 to 20 minutes long, depending on the topic, and they can be viewed at any time. We also have a blog page that has a wealth of information related to a variety of different topics, including standard requirements, risk-based thinking, and other standards related to conformity assessment. We do these webinars monthly. You can check the ANAB website to see what webinars we have coming up in the future. And as I stated at the beginning, all of our webinars are recorded and put on our website for free viewing in the future. We also offer training in many different areas, including internal auditing, overviews of standards, risk-based thinking, validation of methods, and many other topics. We have instructor-led training that can be live online or it can be in person. And we also have a variety of different self-paced trainings as well that you can take on your own time. All of these resources can be found on our website at anab.ansi.org. Now we're going to get into your questions. So the very first question that was asked was if the presentation will be sent out. The recording will be available within the next week as it becomes available through WebEx and we get it up onto our website. So if you'd like to review this presentation or send it to a colleague, it will be up on our website shortly. Our next question says, how do you handle a situation where the person you are auditing does not give you a lot of information or detail even when you are asking probing questions? That's a really good question, and it comes with experience with internal audits. So the person not giving the information. So the more that they participate in the audit, the more comfortable they'll feel giving out that information. I have found from my experience that if I'm asking probing questions and they don't know the answer or are unsure of the answer, they'll shut down. So I may back off from those probing questions and ask short, closed questions that they can answer yes or no quickly to build their confidence. So as they answer this question yes, you could say, could you explain that to me? Or even just to start with, explain the process to me as if you were training me to do the work. That's a good way in method witnessing to get individuals to open up, because they are the quote unquote expert of the process that you're observing or witnessing. They should be if they're the ones put out there for you to observe. So having them gain that confidence that they know the answer and that they can give you the answer. It also helps that they know, depending on kind of the context of your internal audits, that your audits are there to verify conformance. You're not there to tell them what they're doing wrong. And that can ease a lot of the nervousness of the individuals being audited. Then the next question is, please define audit versus assessment. Definition again. So I didn't specifically have that in this presentation, but I can provide a brief explanation. So an audit is determining conformance to requirements. So an auditor comes in, requirement X, here's the document that verifies that they are meeting requirement X. Where the term assessment comes in is going that one step further in determining technical competence. So the assessor has the experience from their own work experience to determine if the method is technically competent, the performance of the method is technically competent. So we are also verifying conformance to requirements, but we're going that one step further in looking at that technical competence on top of the audit piece of that. The next question is pretty specific about forensics experts and how many should be observed directly. And I am going to take that question offline and use and go to our forensics accreditation managers and ask them to address that question for you, since it wasn't the topic of this presentation today and goes into a bit more detail. So I have your name and email address, and I will have someone reach out to you. Then the next question is, can a nonconformity be established regarding the expert's competence derived from his performance in the witnessing carried out in the internal audit and in an ANAB evaluation? For example, during the witnessing, personnel from the laboratory incorrectly classified 3 out of 10 fingerprints. So this depends on the context of your internal audits and your internal audit program. So I can't speak to the ANAB assessment for forensics, but I can say in an internal audit program, from my experience, internal audits are not about individual personnel issues, if that makes sense. It's about the system. So why did they incorrectly classify them? Were they inadequately trained? Were they nervous? Is the procedure not clear? That sort of thing to look at from a systems perspective rather than a personnel perspective. Then we have asking, if you already have a quality supervision plan, do you think method witnessing during an internal audit is necessary? Well, I can't say for certain that it's necessary or not necessary. I can just say that adding that method witnessing to your internal audits is just another mechanism to evaluate your management system for continual improvement. So depending on what that quality supervision plan is, that method witnessing could just be another piece of information for determining conformance to requirements. Again, it's not required to do that method witnessing. Some standards, such as 17025, says laboratory activities need to be included in your internal audit program, but it's up to each individual laboratory based on risk what that means. So we are saying here today that method witnessing is one way to incorporate laboratory activities into your internal audits, but it's not the only way. So if you have a different way of doing it, that's perfectly fine. And again, checking with your accreditation body if they have different interpretations of the requirements or different requirements based on their accreditation programs or certification programs. Then is there a difference when performing a test witness audit externally? If you could provide clarification on that question, I'm not exactly sure what the intent of that question was, and we'll get to it when I get down the list. How do you handle activities that take longer time with wait periods in the process? That is an interesting thing that we experience on assessments because we are at an organization for a specific amount of time. And if there's a wait period, an incubation time, or just the equipment or instrument takes that long, we may not be able to observe all aspects of the process unless we do what I call a cooking show. So the person being witnessed prepares a sample, then a different sample is on the instrument, then a different set of results are looked at. So you can still see all the pieces of the process, just not from start to finish on one item. If that is important to your internal audits to do that, then that's one way that you could set it up. You could also set up internal audits that just look at sample prep in one audit and then look at sample analysis in another audit. So there's a million different ways to do it. You just want to consider what is the objective of your audits and of the specific audit, and what's the best way to evaluate that audit criteria to see if those requirements are met or not. Then is it necessary to witness all personnel perform the same procedure within an internal audit? Or is this something that can be considered sampling by only witnessing one or some individuals? And I would say it depends. So it depends on that risk analysis of, is everyone required to be witnessed? Is it okay that it's one person? So from an assessor perspective, we like to witness as many people as we can, but we're only there for a certain amount of time. Same with your audits. You only have a certain amount of time to perform your internal audit. So as an audit program, you decide, can we sample or do we need to witness every single individual? Then the next question, what do you think about witnessing the same method from two lab technicians in order to also provide feedback to the lab management about repeatability? I would say if that's important to your audit objectives, then that is certainly something that you could add into your internal audits. This could also be maybe you're seeing variability in results, or maybe you get a customer complaint about variability in results, and you're looking through your records, your documentation, and it may be that it's between the different technicians performing the work, or different times of day, or something like that. Method witnessing is one way to gather that objective evidence. Not to say technician A is doing it wrong and technician B is doing it right, but again, to look at it from a systems perspective to see what procedural changes could be made through cause analysis and corrective action to ensure more consistency between technicians that are performing that work. Then the next question is not really related to this presentation, but I will go ahead and just read it and give a little snippet. It says, what if the CAB, or conformity assessment body, refuses to accept the nonconformity? So from an ANAB perspective, we have, from a non-forensics aspect, we have a nonconformity challenge process. So if there's an assessor on site and the organization doesn't agree, then they can go to ANAB and say they don't agree with that nonconformity. So we have a process in place for that. For internal audits, that typically isn't an issue because your internal audits are meant to flush out all the issues that may be in your management system to ensure that it's functioning properly. But if you think about in your own organization having a process for that, then that's perfectly acceptable as well. Our next question is, taking too detailed notes bad? I like to get the flow of the laboratory from receipt to testing, but it's a lot of note taking. I wouldn't say that too detailed notes is bad, like to use the word bad, but you need to balance time management with the notes that you're taking. You also have to consider within your audit program, what are the record control requirements? Are all notes kept, or is it summarized in a report? If you're able to take 5 pages of notes and still get the audit done, then that's how you perform as an auditor. If that bogs you down, then it may be something to continually improve on, that you could take shorter notes with just the key information instead of maybe full sentences or something like that. Then what are some other ways to include laboratory activities that aren't witnessing? That's a really good question that I did not put into the presentation, but other ways are review of results, review of records, review of reports. So more of like a document review. It can also be just that general observation of walking through the laboratory to get that facilities and environmental conditions without that witnessing. Just gathering information from the documents and records and the management system that are related to laboratory activities rather than actually observing the work being performed. Going that one step further to observe the work provides that little bit more information for you to say the work being performed matches what our requirements are or doesn't if there is a nonconformity. Okay, let me go back up to this question that we had that I needed to have clarified. Is there a difference when performing a test witness audit externally and audit outside your own organization, not an internal audit? So maybe like a supplier audit. So you're going out to audit one of your vendors or your external providers. So that depends on how your audit program is set up. If you have an external provider that's doing a technical aspect for you, maybe they're creating an item that then goes straight to a customer, you may want to do method witnessing to make sure they're doing it correctly. It just depends on how your external audit program is set up, or your vendor qualification, so to speak, is set up. If it makes sense to do method witnessing, then you could add that in as part of your contract with that external provider, or it may not be necessary to do that, and that may be kind of overdoing it and not mitigating risk. So really, our internal audits help us continually improve our management system internally, and externally can help mitigate risks related to those external providers that are providing items to us, either items or services to us. And then I have one more question on this tab. In a paperless project, is it necessary to create a procedure training to make sure the personnel knows how to submit daily checks in a personal digital assistant? So that's outside the scope of this webinar. I would say you'd need to evaluate the process and determine if, so from a 17025 perspective, it says to document your processes to the extent necessary for consistency and validity of results, not word for word. So if it can be performed consistently and not impact the validity of results, then what you have documented may be enough. If not, you may need to have additional documentation for that. So again, that was kind of outside the flow or the scope of this webinar, but just a little bit of information. I'm just scrolling through the rest of these. And I think that was all of our questions. We do still have 9 minutes to the top of the hour. I will keep the webinar open for a few more minutes to see if any other questions come in. If you do need to hop off, this is being recorded and will be up on our website as access to the webinar once the recording is available. I want to thank you all for attending today, and I hope that you learned something from this webinar, and if it is feasible and appropriate, that you add method witnessing to your internal audit program as well. Up on the screen now, I have some contact information. If you want more information about training, you can email training@anab.org. If you want additional information about accreditation services, or you have questions about this webinar that you didn't get to ask, you can email anab@anab.org. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thank you. And I will unmute, and we had one additional question come in to explain what I meant when I said the notes should be detailed enough to recreate the observation. So we're taking notes during internal audits to document conformity or nonconformity with requirements, and we want those notes to be detailed enough that when we look at those notes in the future, that we can continue to declare conformity or nonconformity to requirements. So we're taking down that objective evidence, times, temperatures, personnel, lot numbers, locations, things like that, that we can then recreate that quote unquote scenario that we observed to continue to determine if it's conforming or non-conforming.